Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are very happy to be here with all of you. A big shout out to those who are celebrating their reunion this week. As many of you know, we are celebrating 2 cycles of reunions virtually this year. And while it's unfortunate that we're not all gathering in Castle Court or on Temple Green to have this tasting, we're very excited, for the opportunity to be able to welcome some alumni from our community that sometimes, may not have been able to otherwise join us in person. So just a quick intro. My name is Dina Poblete. I'm an Assistant Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement here at the college. I've been at the college for about 5 years, and I've had the honor of working with our featured guest tonight, Adam Romanow, class of 2007, a few times in the past for some previous programming. So Adam Romanow is the founder and president of Castle Island Brewing Company. He's a lifelong resident from the Boston area. His professional background includes time in management, consulting, strategic market research, production brewing, sales and marketing for the beer industry. As the company's president, Adam has oversight and responsibility for business strategy, brand philosophy, and marketing and sales and marketing. He's an experienced home brewer, avid cook, lover of the outdoors, musician, and a huge Red Sox and Patriots fan. For all of you Massachusetts residents here. So as I mentioned, Adam graduated from Conn in 2007 with dual degrees in economics and philosophy. So I'm going to give Adam a chance to talk about his background a bit more in depth before we get started with the actual tasting. But first, just a few quick housekeeping items. If everyone could start while Adam is going through the tasting piece to start with muting yourselves, that would be great. And then after each beer, we can take Q&A through the chat. So if you want to type in questions after each beer, Adam can touch on the questions or throughout if we have time. And then as he'll answer questions along the way, time permitting, we can take more questions at the end. So Adam, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about what got you into brewing and the backstory of Castle Island?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just start. Dina mentioned I'm, class of 2007, but I actually come from a line of Camels. My grandmother went to Conn, my uncle went to Conn, my second cousin went to Conn. I met my wife at Conn. My 2 younger brothers graduated from Conn, and yet none of them are on this call tonight. So brownie points to all of you for signing up, and there's not another Romanow on the phone. It's going to make for some good conversation around the Thanksgiving table this year. Before I start talking about my background, which I'll do in a little bit, I always like to start with a beer so that you're not staring at 4 closed cans wondering why you can't open it yet. So for those of you who didn't dip in a little early or didn't have a family member dip in a little early, you're going to reach for Bohemian Shine in the red and white can. Bohemian Shine is a Czech style Pilsner or Bohemian Pilsner. It's 4.9% alcohol by volume, so really light, really crisp. There's an awesome hop flavor that comes through with this beer. A lot of Pilsners tend to be really light. In fact, Budweiser and Miller and Coors, those are all categorically Pilsners. But what we've done is kind of create a Pilsner that is almost more like a lager for the IPA drinker. So it's still light and crisp, but there's a lot of hop flavor that comes through at the start and the finish and the aroma, but you don't get a ton of that hop bitterness. One of the things we love about this beer is it's actually, in terms of ingredients, one of the simplest beers to make. But in terms of process, it's one of our most complex. And we're especially proud of it because in 2019, 2 years ago, it picked up the gold medal for the Bohemian Pilsner category at the Great American Beer Festival out in Denver, which is the largest beer competition in the world, actually. So really special beer, really close to our hearts. We don't make it all the time, but wanted to share it with all of you, and we'll start off with that tonight. So with that, cheers, and let's begin the fun. I should mention, by the way, one ground rule I always like to lay down. You definitely do not need to drink all of every single beer. 4 beers in an hour is a lot, even for a guy like me who does this for a living. I do ask that you try all the beers. So if there's a flavor that's new to you, the whole point of tonight is to have some fun and expand your horizons. But I definitely do not expect anyone to put back 64 full ounces of beer. That would be a little on the aggressive side. So let me tell you a little bit about my background, how I ended up in the beer business. Obviously, I didn't go to con for beer. I went to con for economics and philosophy. In a lot of ways, those weave together really nicely for this industry. But coming out of school, I went into the consulting industry. I worked for a firm that did executive compensation consulting. So we were writing pay packages for CEOs and CFOs at public and private companies throughout the country. I had actually interned with them in between my junior and senior years, and that turned into a full-time job offer, which, you know, getting a job offer in October of your senior year is like the best gift ever, because then you're pretty much done the rest of the year. And so in July of 2007, after I graduated, I went in full-time and started working for them. And I worked for them right up until the end of 2010. And in the time where I worked for them, you know, we saw the housing crisis and the ensuing financial crisis, and we were writing $50 million pay packages for CEOs, and a lot of people around the country were losing retirement wealth, and just wasn't a real feel-good industry. So I decided to leave. I'd been homebrewing for a little while at the time, and I was fortunate enough to get an unpaid apprenticeship at a brewery up in New Hampshire. So with the idea that I was just going to take a 6-month kind of professional vacation, clear the brain a little bit, I worked unpaid for 6 months, scrubbing floors, cleaning brewing tanks, packaging beer, eventually brewing beer, and then brewing my own beer. I got the opportunity to brew one batch of beer up there that was commercially released, and it ended up being a success. And I said, gee, I think I like this a little bit more than sitting behind a desk. And I decided at that point that I wanted to go into the beer industry full time. So I took the next logical step, went back into the consulting industry, this time doing market research and strategy for law firms. Because it turned out that cleaning floors and brewing tanks didn't pay a whole heck of a lot. And I was living in Boston and needed to keep up with that. So I went back into consulting to make a little bit of money while I started writing a business plan, raising capital, finding the team, finding the space, and ultimately leading towards opening our doors at the very tail end of 2015. So we opened Castle Island December 11th, 2015, which puts us right around the 5.5-year mark. In our first year around, we were named Best New Brewery in Massachusetts by Rate Beer, which is an internationally recognized beer rating organization. And since then, we've been fortunate enough to win a handful of medals for our beers. And just 2 months ago, we made the top brewers list in Massachusetts. We are now number 10 by volume in the state of Massachusetts, with about 220 breweries in the state. So in a very short amount of time, things have grown very quickly and very rapidly, but we're having a lot of fun with it. We are based in Norwood, Mass. For anyone who kind of missed the preamble up front, Norwood is a small town about 20 minutes south of Boston. We did not originally plan to be in the town of Norwood. So the Castle Island name, for those who are from around the Boston area or in the Boston area, Castle Island is an actual physical place in Boston, specifically in the neighborhood of South Boston, where I live. I've been in South Boston, aka Southie, for the past 12 years. I live about a block away from Castle Island. It's my absolute favorite place in the city of Boston. And I thought it'd make a pretty nice name for a brewery. I also thought South Boston would make a great place for a brewery until I started looking for space and realized it didn't exist. South Boston has a really rich manufacturing history, and at one point there was a ton of great space that would have suited us perfectly. But over the years, as the city of Boston has developed, all of that old industrial space has been rezoned and converted into condos and retail space and commercial space, and there's no room for a beer factory in Southie anymore. So using a broker, we expanded our search outside the city and landed on the town of Norwood, which even for those who are from the Boston area, Norwood may not be a place they know well, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Really friendly small business community here, very supportive local base. In addition to that, the building and the town had a lot of things that you don't really think about when you're starting a brewery, like how close are we to the major highways? What kind of outdoor space do we have? Do we have loading docks? Do we have enough electrical capacity in the building? All these small details that when you're starting your very first brewery, there's no book that says, hey, make sure you have enough of this. But the building that we landed in had all that stuff. And if we didn't have it, it would have cost us a fortune. So it's worked out in a number of ways. And what we've really built here is a true manufacturing facility with a small showroom. I did mention briefly for those who are on, we are in the process of actually expanding, but I will talk about that in a little bit. I did see a question come through the chat. Susan wants to know what types of hops are in the first beer. Great question. There are 2 hops in this beer. One of them is German, one of them is Czech. The German hop is a hop called Magnum that we use for bittering. It's very, very clean. Let me talk in a second about the brewing process to kind of bring everyone into that world. But Magnum gives us just a little bit of bitterness to balance out the sweetness from the malt. The other hop that's in this beer is from the Czech Republic. It's a hop called Saaz, spelled S-A-A-Z. And Saaz is a hop that is known for fresh cut grass characteristics. It almost has a hay-like quality to it. A lot of people get fresh flowers. In other words, it's vibrant, it's bright, it's herbal. That's what you're getting in the aroma. Now, I'm going to stop talking about hops for a second to talk about the brewing process, because I think that might be beneficial to some questions. And I'll bet there probably aren't a ton of people on this that at least have brewed beer or have been on brewery tours or anything like that. So in beer, you've got 4 main ingredients. You've got grain, you've got water, hops, and yeast. Grain, that first one, is pretty much always barley, but sometimes it can also include wheat, rye, oats, corn, or some of the other secondary grains. Water, everyone is obviously familiar with, and we're very fortunate here in Norwood, or in the Northeast generally. We have awesome brewing water in this area. It's very soft, very clean. The pH stays very stable all year, so we're blessed with incredible brewing water. Hops are a flower. They kind of look like leafy green pine cones. If you've ever seen a Sam Adams ad on TV, Jim Cook is usually there in his denim suit rubbing hops in his hands. That's what hops look like. Hops give us bitterness, they give us flavor, they give us aroma, and to a degree, they give us shelf stability. There are antibacterial properties to hops. And then there's a saying in the beer business that brewers don't make beer, brewers make wort, and yeast makes beer. That's because the 4th and final ingredient, yeast, is what actually ferments the starchy sugars from the grain, converting it into alcohol, carbon dioxide, flavors, and aromas. So we really just make this kind of hoppy, sweet tea for the yeast to then convert into alcohol for us. So that's the saying, it's the yeast that makes the beer. We're mixing the crushed grain in hot water, steeping it for about an hour to extract the sugars from the grain. We'll then separate the solid from the liquid. We bring the liquid up to a full rolling boil, and we'll add hops during that boil to give us the bitterness and the flavor. The earlier we add the hops, the more bitterness we get. So that Magnum hop that I mentioned before in Bohemian Shine, we're adding that very early on in the process to give us just a little bit of bitterness to balance out the sweet from the grain. The later we add hops, the more flavor and aroma we get. Believe it or not, the Czech Saaz hop that we use in this beer, we're actually not adding during the boil. So we'll bring that to a boil, we cool it down, we ferment the beer with the yeast, and then we add that hop after the fact. Because alcohol is a natural solvent, it will actually pull some of the flavor and aroma from the hops after fermentation, and that's where you get that bouquet of amazing aroma from. And the last 2 beers in the lineup tonight really showcase that big hoppy aroma, but we'll get to those shortly. That is brewing beer in a really quick nutshell. As you can imagine, it's as much science as it is art. I like to tell people the art is coming up with a recipe, the science is executing it the same way every time, because the consumers are really picky, and if they buy a beer once, they want to know it's going to taste exactly the same the next time they go to grab it off the shelf. But we have an awesome team here of 35 people that help brew, package, market, sell, and then of course run the underlying business as well. And it's really because of them that all the magic happens. I'm just the guy who, I guess, brought them together. I'll pause there to take any questions before, believe it or not, we move on to the next beer. All right. So next beer in the lineup, and I know it probably feels like we're moving kind of quickly, but believe it or not, an hour is not a ton of time. Next beer in the lineup is our white ale, which unironically is in the orange can. So our white ale is a Belgian style wit or Belgian style wheat beer. There are two really, really known Belgian style wit beers on the market today. One of them is Allagash White, brewed up in Portland, Maine. And the other one is Blue Moon, owned by Miller Brewing Company and brewed in a bunch of different places across the country. Outside of those two behemoths, if you will, there are not a lot of Belgian wheat beers on the market. We decided a few years ago to brew a small pilot batch, an R&D batch, if you will, of a white ale for a beer dinner that we had upcoming. We thought it would be a really nice food pairing beer. And at the beer dinner itself, it was such a hit that we said, you know what, we got to make this a year-round beer. And that's essentially how we landed on our white ale. It's 5.4% alcohol by volume, so it's got a little bit of a kick to it, but in the grand scheme of beer, it's still considered mid-range alcohol. And then the really special thing about this beer is it's fermented with Belgian wheat yeast, which will give you some phenolic, clovey aromas. And as it also gets a heavy hand of orange and coriander. The traditional way of brewing Belgian wit beers is to use orange peel, which does give you a little bit of bitterness, a hint of citrus, but we kind of go over the top with it, and we actually use all the parts of the orange. We use the juice, we use the rind, we use the peel, we use the oil from the peel. So you get this massive blast of citrus right up front as soon as you open the can. That for us is kind of like drinking liquid sunlight. So we love this beer in this time of year. We do make it year round, but on a brutally hot day, something like this just absolutely takes the heat right off. So with that, enjoy white ale. I saw a couple questions come through. I want to get to those. All right. Brew here at Stone Ridge and do a lot of sterilizing. Interesting. I'm not familiar with Stone Ridge, but I can tell you the manufacturing process for beer, because it's a food product, takes an amazing amount of cleaning and sanitizing. Thankfully, because we make a product that contains alcohol, which helps protect against a lot of spoilage organisms, we don't actually have to sterilize our equipment, believe it or not. Food grade sanitation is enough to meet our quality standards, and that's pretty standard across the industry as well. But we still have to clean every piece of equipment between every single batch of beer. There was a question, do we distribute outside of Mass? We do. We are in Southern New England, so Mass, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Our strongest distribution, obviously, is here in our home state, but you can find our beers in those three. Bob wants to know, why is barley the most frequently used grain in brewing of beers, given that other grains get used, but not nearly as much? Barley is a really great base grain for brewing, and I say base in the terms of barley is to beer like wheat flour is to cake. It's not going to be all of your recipe, but it's going to be most of it. It's a great base grain for two reasons. Number one, it has a really high sugar content. So pound for pound, you're going to get more alcohol capacity or more fermentability out of barley than some of the other grains. The second really great thing about barley is that it has a husk. So if you've ever seen a kernel of barley, it sort of looks like a teardrop. And what we actually want are the starches on the inside of that. But the husk itself that forms that exterior teardrop shape, we process through a grain mill that cracks it open, gives us access to the starches inside, but keeps that husk intact. And in the brewing process, when we mix barley with hot water, that husk acts as a natural filtration aid. Without that, we would end up making this thick, syrupy porridge, and we'd have a really hard time separating the solid from the liquid. But barley is far better than wheat or corn or rye or oats or anything at giving us that natural filtration aid. Our flagship beer. What is our flagship beer? We actually don't have it tonight. Could have been the greatest miss on my part or just really good planning. Our number one seller is a beer called Keeper. It's our IPA. It comes in a bright green can. Surprised I don't have one on my desk. That beer comprises more than 50% of our sales, believe it or not. It's one of the 2 beers that we opened the brewery with back in 2015. It's a little bit of a unique beer in today's market. Not that IPAs are unique, but Keeper is almost crystal clear and has a little bit more of a bitter edge compared to New England IPAs, which are dominating the market right now and are very hazy with almost little to no bitterness. But that one we kind of intentionally left out tonight just because it's the one that most people had most likely tried, and it's easily the easiest one to find. Sam, appreciate the Norwood love. Oh, you're from Westwood and you live in East Walpole and formerly Southie. Excellent. Well, Sam, we're right off of Route 1 behind the Petco on Route 1 North, so easy to find if you're in the area. Awesome. So with that, one of the things I didn't mention about white ales, categorically speaking, and especially this one, are awesome food pairing beers. So whether you're doing a beer dinner, like I told you, that's kind of how this one got invented, or you want to just, I don't know, you feel like having a little bit of charcuterie at home for dinner one night. White ales are a universal pairing beer. They go with just about everything. The complexity from the coriander and the orange is enough to stand up, believe it or not, to like a fatty cheeseburger. Or it's a great seafood beer. That citrus complements it really, really well. And you can actually use it as an ingredient. One of my favorite things to do with this beer is use it as a steaming base for steaming mussels. So if there are any aspiring home cooks and you have any of this extra, would be worth popping in the fridge, even if you don't, cap it because it's in a can. It still makes for really, really great cooking liquid. So one of the things I alluded to before is that we're in Norwood, we're expanding to South Boston. There was a little bit of press that came out a few months ago, so some people might have the leading edge on this, but for those who have no idea what I'm talking about, we got very, very lucky. About 2 years ago, we got a phone call that I'm hoping will change our lives. We've always had eyes on returning to South Boston and opening a tap room there, something that's less manufacturing heavy, more retail heavy. And 2 years ago, a local commercial real estate developer called us and said, hey, we've got this awesome space in South Boston. We're looking for a brewery to come in. Are you guys interested? We said, sure, where's the space? And they said, oh, it's the old Cole Hersey building on Old Colony Ave. Do you know it? And turns out I know it really well. My great-grandfather started Cole Hersey, which was an electrical switch manufacturer. He started it about 100 years ago. And they had just purchased the building from extended family, and they called us up, and we honestly couldn't have been happier to jump at the chance. So in 2019, we signed a lease. We raised some more money to go open the second location. We were ready to go, shovels in the ground in March of last year. And then I obviously don't have to tell anybody what happened after that. So we spent 9 months in 2020 sitting on a bunch of money that we had just raised to open a second location, architectural plans, a building permit, pretty much everything you need to get going. Really just twiddling our thumbs while we waited to start construction. But pleased to say that construction did resume at the end of December last year, and we are steamrolling right ahead for an opening before the end of next month, believe it or not. Sometime in the middle of July, we're hoping to open. That facility is a 5-minute walk from the Broadway T station for anyone who's familiar with the T network. It's not even 2 miles from the actual Castle Island. So we're finally bringing the brand back home to its namesake in a building with manufacturing heritage and family heritage. And the real kind of fun part of it is this facility is designed to be our new R&D home. So we've put in a small system there that's 1/3 the size of our production system. And the goal for this system is just to crank out new recipes. And we gave the opportunity to a brewer who just joined us last week, whose sole job is to have fun and make new beers, which if you're a brewer is like the best job in the world, because all you do is create There are no boundaries. You go totally off the wall. And so that's what he's going to be doing up there in South Boston. We also are going to have something up there that we have not had the opportunity to have at our existing brewery, which is a kitchen. So it's really a tap room that serves food, not a restaurant that makes its own beer. But for those who are from the Boston area, you may or may not be familiar with South Shore style bar pizza. If you are, you know the majesty of it. If you're not, it's this very unassuming 10-inch pizza that has sauce to the edges. The cheese is a blend of mozzarella and cheddar, which sounds really unique for a pizza. But the whole idea is it is like the perfect bite to pair with a beer. And honestly, what goes better than beer and pizza together? So we are partnering with some of our friends who have a lot more experience running kitchens than we do to provide South Shore style bar pizzas on site to pair with the beers. So that's the concept that we're launching in South Boston next month. It's been the number one thing on my agenda for the last 6 months, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So anytime anyone is up in the Southie area starting next month, please do come pay us a visit. Speaking of paying us a visit, I should mention that our tap room in Norwood is open 7 days a week now. For a while, we were on reduced hours because of COVID, but as of this week, we're back to 7 days. And you can check out hours on our website at castleislandbeer.com. But long story short, you can come inside the brewery. You can sit down and have a pint in the building where the beer was brewed. We sell beer to go. We sell merchandise. At some point in the future, we want to start doing tours again. We're still kind of tiptoeing around that one with COVID. But by far, my favorite thing about our brewing space is when you come in, you walk directly into the warehouse, which is where the tap room is located. And just beyond kind of a half-height wall is all of the production facility. There are no walls. There's no glass. You hear everything that's going on. You smell everything that's going on. You see the whole production operation. It's this very immersive experience as far as being a beer consumer goes. And for me, a lot of that came from time that I spent visiting a close friend of mine, another Con alum, who lives out in San Diego. San Diego obviously has far better weather than we do here in Boston. But one of the things I loved about the breweries out there is how much they wanted to connect consumers with the product. And so they didn't have the tap room in a totally separate room. They put it right in the middle of the brewery. So you really get to see everything that's going on. And it creates this wonderful transparency and honesty because there's nothing to hide behind at that point. And for me, and I think for a lot of the people out there, that is the magic of the craft beer business. You know, we're not big macro beer where the beer is made in a giant warehouse somewhere in the Midwest and then trucked miles and miles. You get to see exactly where the beer is being made. You get to talk to the brewers that are making it. It's a very, I guess, integrated process, if you will. So I highly recommend next time you're up in the area, come pay us a visit. Even if you're not a beer drinker, certainly a sight to be seen. I think I saw a question come in there. Will there be food, social space like Trillium? That's fine, Sam. I don't mind mentioning our competitor. They are right around the corner from us. There's a brewery called Trillium, who's very well known nationally and internationally. But in reality, as competitive as this industry is, we all kind of get along. The reality is we're still going up against the Buds, the Millers, the Coors of the world. And there's definitely a sense of camaraderie and in it togetherness that comes from being a small brewer. What a lot of people don't realize is, yes, there are 8,000 breweries in the country, which sounds like an insane amount. But those 8,000 small breweries comprise less than 12% of the overall beer market by volume. That's how staggeringly monolithic Budweiser, Miller, and Coors are. So even though Trillium is, I don't know, 6-7 times larger than we are, and in theory, we're probably losing a little bit of business to them, it pales in comparison to what we're going up against with the big guys. Mike and Scott want to know, how many different varieties do we brew at the same time? Great question. So we have 6 different year-round beers that are always available in the market through distribution. We have an additional 7th year-round beer that sometimes goes out to market, but year-round stays in-house. So I like to tell people we have 7 year-round beers. On top of that, we do a different limited release every month that goes out to market. And then we have almost every single week throughout the course of the year, a limited release that only gets released in-house. These are really small batches, about 150 gallons a batch. Will yield 35 to 45 cases from each run, and it lasts maybe 2 days. And then we're on to the next one. So how many different varieties at any one time? Call it 9 or 10 beers, but over the course of a year, we're going to brew north of 70 different beers, which is a lot to keep track of. We're also, this is probably not surprising, in a very heavily regulated business. So every drop of beer, whether it goes into a can, goes down the drain, has to be accounted for at both the state and federal levels. So we love brewing variety, but it's also a massive headache at times. All right, we are going to be moving on, believe it or not, to the next beer. So reach for Fiverr in the blue and blue can. Fiverr is 6.3% alcohol by volume. One of our newer year-round beers. We started brewing this back in September of last year. And Fiverr is really special for a couple of reasons. Number one, I mentioned before, Keeper, our flagship IPA, is not hazy and juicy, which is the kind of contemporary style. We held out for 5 years on hazy IPAs. It was just not a sector of the industry that we really wanted to get into until we had a product we were proud of. So the beer that ultimately became Fiverr went through almost 2 years of R&D and product testing before we finally landed on a recipe we were happy with. And one of the chief complaints we had about hazy IPAs in the market is some of them were too syrupy and sweet and hard to drink. They had great aromas, but as soon as you tasted the beer, it was like trying to drink undiluted soda syrup. And that's not really what we wanted out of a beer. It was challenging to find something that was juicy and fruity, but still finished dry so that your palate isn't coated and slick and so that you want another sip. Really tough balance to achieve for basically reasons of science that I'd be happy to get into, but it would chew up 30 minutes of this call. But the takeaway is it took us a long time to really nail what we wanted with this beer. The other really special part about Fiverr is where the name comes from. So Fiverr itself is our philanthropic vehicle here at Castle Island. And the name Fiverr derives from the fact that 5% of sales of this beer go directly back to charity. We partner with 5 different charities on an annual basis. And at the end of the year, we're going to be writing each of them a nice check based on the sales of this beer. In the past, when we did charitable work, it was a little bit scattershot and a little bit opportunistic. And we found that sometimes we were writing checks to charities for a couple $1,000s, sometimes it was a couple $100s, and it didn't feel quite as meaningful. So we focused the program, created the Fiverr initiative, and at the end of this year, we'll be writing checks to Artists for Humanity, which is a local organization that provides paid employment work for at-risk youth in the arts. For Mass Audubon, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, they protect and promote a lot of the natural wildlife habitats in Massachusetts. The Atlantic White Shark Conservancy is one of our partners. They promote and expand knowledge on great white sharks off of Cape Cod, of which there are plenty right now. We are working with the Doug Flutie Jr. Foundation for Autism, which is an absolutely amazing organization helmed up by none other than Doug Flutie himself. And side note, if you happen to be in the Norwood area, we've actually got the Doug Flutie Jr. Foundation. They're putting on a show here Friday night with live entertainment. So if you're in the area, come by. And then the last charity that we're working with this year is a really cool organization out of Brookline, Mass, called Facing History and Ourselves. And their mission is to basically promote and educate people on the history of this country to try and drive better public policy. So 5 really cool partners that we're working with, all centered around the idea of drinking super tasty beer, which is a mission that we felt we could get behind. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that drives us here at Castle Island, one of the things we talk about all the time. There's a mural that's going to go up on our wall in South Boston. It's on a ton of our print collateral, is the idea that we should all be excellent to each other. And it's a quote that's derived directly from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, movie from the late 80s, if anyone's ever seen it. But it really, a lot of us are, we're children of the 80s and 90s, and it hits home to us, the idea that at the end of the day, we're all human, we all bleed red, however you want to talk about it, we all need to be excellent to each other. And that's what drives us here at Castle Island. That's what drives Fiverr. And ultimately, that's what drives this super tasty liquid. I'm going to stop for 1 second to take a sip, and it looks like we have a question popping up in the chat. Ethan wants to know, how have you decided which beers you're going to make? Also, cheers to not just doing hazy IPAs. Perfect timing since we're on the hazy IPA, but you are very welcome for that. How do we decide what beers we're going to make? In short, it's at the intersection of what we want to make and what we know we can sell. But to obviously go into a little more depth than that, we want to make beers that we're proud of, beers that we know we can execute well. We're not big on shortcuts. We're not big on gimmicks or chasing hype or anything like that. We want to make sure that the liquid we're putting in a can is something we're proud to put our name on. And when we toured the facility that we're in down here in Norwood, there was a sign hanging above the loading docks that our predecessors had put up that said, if you're not proud of it, don't ship it. And that's another phrase that we've really internalized. So when we think about what beer we're going to make, it's, is this something we can execute? And is this something we're going to be proud to ship? We do have to run that through the filter of what's marketable, what do people want to buy. I, for example, love smoked beer, which is an entire category of beer. Not really marketable. It's kind of a tough sell. So that sort of limits our ability to brew things that are way off the beaten path. If you look at our catalog of beers, it's very IPA heavy and very lager heavy and very sour heavy, because that's what sells right now. But if you come into our tap room where we have the ability to walk you through how a smoked beer is made, or why an alt beer is supposed to taste different, we have an opportunity to educate you and bring you into our world a little bit and tell you about why these other beer styles need to see the light of day. And we're hoping that, drop by drop, we can get people drinking something in addition to IPAs. We're not trying to replace them, just trying to supplement. Mont, the design of the can is obviously super important to communicate to a potential buyer to pick your beer. What goes into the process of choosing a design, colors, wording, etc.? This is one of the hardest parts about this business for sure. Talking about naming and wording for a second. So beer competes with wine, spirits, and non-alcoholic beverages for trademarks. So when we're naming beers, we have to get really creative. On top of that, we want to make sure that whatever we're calling the beer and however we're talking about the beer in the copy on the can reflects the liquid, reflects our brand. It all kind of needs to line up, because our approach to market is we sell everything as Castle Island Brewing, and we have that kind of mother brand, if you will. And then we have all these sub brands that need to align within those parameters. So definitely tricky from a copywriting perspective. When it comes to design and colors, in the past, we've leaned a little bit more towards a hard and fast system. And the 4 beers that we have in front of us tonight stick with that system, where you've got a large color block up top, a small color block underneath, and an accent band in between. And what we were trying to do with that is create a really nice billboard effect, so that if you walk into a liquor store, hopefully you see 5 or 6 Castle Island beers lined up to each other and you go, oh, okay, I know that's Castle Island. So there's this really strong presence that it generates. But what we've started to do is get a little more creative with some of our designs, because frankly, the market is shifting that way. A lot of that is driven, in my personal opinion, by Instagram culture, where people want something new and flashy and different all the time. So by example, and only because I have it handy, Derg Doom was a beer that we did for St. Patrick's Day. So there's actually a full kind of landscape art on this can that wraps all the way around. And we've got a bunch of cans that are more in that vein rolling down the line. And a lot of our labels are sort of transitioning that way over time. But in short, Mont, it's complicated, but it is very deliberate. Mike and Scott want to know, how many people do we employ during non-COVID times? So pre-COVID, we had 35 employees. March 23rd of 2020, we went down to 5 employees. April 25th of 2020, we went back to 35 employees, and we now have 40 employees. So we've recovered, rehired, and even grown beyond that. And the opening of the South Boston location is going to have us almost doubling those numbers, which is intimidating to say the least, but exciting because we get to meet a lot of new people. Jim's asking, will the small batches brewed at your new location only be available there, or will they make it down to Norwood too? Jim, the plan is to try and keep as much of it in South Boston as possible, because we have a separate pilot system here in Norwood that's a little bit smaller, but there will definitely be some crossover inventory between the two. The real kind of key is that everything brewed in South Boston is going to be kegged. It's all going to be draft beer because we don't have any room for packaging up there, which is one of the big driving forces behind why we didn't land in South Boston 5.5 years ago. And then Emily, do you drink any beer besides your own? Great question. And a question I get quite a bit. Yes, in short, I do. Number one, I want to see what the competition is up to, and quite honestly, what my friends are up to. Number two, I think it's a great way to try new flavors. There are, oh boy, 60, 70 different hop varieties out there that are common. There are hundreds of grain varieties, thousands of yeast strains, and there are more and more coming out every single day. You couldn't possibly test all of them in-house, so it's important to see what other people are doing. But I also find myself, quite honestly, when I'm at home, I don't drink a lot of beer. I drink more wine, I drink more spirits. Number one, when you drink beer for a living, sometimes you go home, you don't want to look at beer. And number two, I find myself being very heavily influenced by other alcoholic beverages, and either sometimes non-alcoholic beverages. And a lot of times those make it into the final beer. So I mentioned before, we do a different limited release every month. The limited release that's out this month, which I would have loved to include, but it wasn't packaged when we mailed all this out, is a collaboration beer we did with Loco Taqueria, which is a taco shop in South Boston down the street from my house. And we did a spicy margarita-inspired sour ale. So we basically came up with a sour ale base recipe, and then on top of that, we dosed 120 pounds of pureed chipotles, a ton of limes, and a bunch of sea salt. And it tastes like a spicy margarita. And that kind of inspiration only comes from drinking outside of beer. So I find it very important and refreshing to, constantly drink other people's beers as well as other beverages in general. All right, we, believe it or not, are at 7:45, so we're going to move on to the final beer of the night. For some of you, that beer is going to look like this, and it's going to be called Vern. And for others of you, that beer is going to come in a pink can called Good Human. We had originally planned to give everybody Vern, and we set aside 40 cans of Vern. And then we ended up overselling tonight, so we had to come up with something else because Vern was sold out. Good Human, however, is a very close proxy for Vern. The biggest difference is Good Human is lower in alcohol, whereas Vern is higher in alcohol. But both of them are wheat-heavy IPAs, meaning the grain bill in both of them contains, as I mentioned before, barley, but a ton of flaked wheat, which gives us haze, which gives us mouthfeel, which gives us a little bit extra head retention and a bit of graininess. The hops in Vern is a very mosaic-heavy beer. Mosaic is a hop grown in the Pacific Northwest that for me is floral and fruity. I get a lot of like orchid flower and melon, which are very unique aromas to get from a hop like that. Good Human, by contrast, uses a hop called Citra, which is very citrus forward, hence the name Citra. But in both of them, you're going to get this awesome tropical fruit salad nose that you wouldn't think comes from hops, A lot of times people taste these beers and go, what fruit's in here? And there's no fruit in here. It's grain, it's water, it's hops, it's yeast. That's it. But both very special beers that are in-house only. We do not send these 2 beers out into the market, unlike the first 3. So we wanted to make sure that you're all getting access to something that you might not otherwise be able to get, unless, of course, you were to come to the brewery. I'm going to breathe for a second and take a quick sip. And I think I missed a question come in. How do you have the discipline to know when you're done when you're making a new beer? Great question. And to be honest with you, at least in my eyes, we're never really done making a beer. Even when we feel like the recipe is good enough to put our stamp of approval on and send out to the market, there are still things that we want to tweak here and there. Generally speaking, these are things that are imperceptible to the customer, but they help us with our process a little bit more. Maybe we can dial up a certain aroma from the hops and dial back another just by tweaking the amounts of the hops that are in there. But we're always kind of chasing perfection. And one of the biggest challenges in beer is that grain and hops are both agricultural products. And so we're dealing with agricultural forces. Yeast is a biological organism, and it kind of does what it wants. So when you're brewing beer, you have to be a little flexible, and you kind of have to be willing to, duck with the punches a little bit, because it's always going to taste a little bit different than you expect. And so the idea of being done, as in this is perfect, we're never going to change it again, isn't something that we really embrace. I will say, if you look at something like Bud Light, where it's produced all around the world and it tastes exactly the same everywhere, that recipe is as done as it gets. They're never changing that. But we, being a small producer, are a little more flexible. Emily, do we grow our own hops or yeast? We do not grow our own hops. Hops, believe it or not, take a ton of land. Hops grow on, they're called bines with a B, that end up growing anywhere from 10 to 16 or 18 feet tall. And they grow in really long rows in giant acreages. So we don't have the space here. Hops additionally need to be processed typically for use. You can use them in that leafy green pine cone form, but because they contain water, you need a lot more. You need about 3 times the hops by weight. The form we buy them in, they're dried, they're pelletized. It kind of looks like rabbit food. We don't have the equipment to do that. So we do not grow our own hops. As for yeast, we sort of do grow our own yeast and we sort of don't. So we buy probably 4 or 5 times a year commercial yeast pitches from one of 3 different major yeast labs in the country. And they'll send it to us in a giant food grade, basically plastic jug. We will add that yeast to the beer. And as the yeast is actually consuming the sugars and creating alcohol, the yeast will bud off from itself and it'll multiply in volume. The fermenters that we have are conically shaped at the bottom, so that yeast will actually collect in the cone, and then we can harvest it off of that cone to reuse in the next batch. So on the initial delivery, it's coming from a factory, but after that, we harvest and reuse all of our yeast. At the risk of opening it up, I want to know what people's favorite beers have been tonight. What do people like so far?
Do you want me to open it up? And I'm gonna remove Adam from the spotlight and let everybody chime in. So.
All right, we've got votes for Fiverr and Vern.
I like white.
I like the white.
All right, we got white on the board.
Fiverr, another vote for Fiverr.
I like the Bohemian, whatever it is.
Shine.
Bohemian Shine.
Yeah.
Shine?
Me too.
Awesome.
The first one?
The Bohemian Shine was my favorite too. I dug into my kit early.
Not a problem.
I guess I'm gonna have to go buy some.
Vern.
Thank you. Yeah, Vern is a perennial favorite around here, mostly because we brewed it our first full year in business, so 2016, and it only comes around once a year. It's right around like the tail end of springtime, kind of right where we are right now. And I think everyone around here just loves Mosaic, the hop that I was mentioning in it. So really glad that we got to share that one with everyone tonight. What else do you guys want to know? What other questions can I answer for you? I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A here.
I have a question about ales. What's the difference, and do you do any of that?
Yeah, great question. So categorically, beer kind of falls into one of two buckets. There are ales and there are lagers. And the distinction there is the type of yeast that actually ferments the wort, the unfermented liquid. Ales ferment from the top of the tank down, quite literally top down, at warmer temperatures and faster. And lagers ferment from the bottom up at lower temperatures and slower. Within both of those spectrums, you could take the exact same grain bill, the same hops, the same water, and have two totally different beers. So a lot of times when people say, oh, do you brew ales? I think a lot of times what they're referring to are more English style ales, which is kind of how the term ale has been used in the past. Those are styles that are maltier, a little bit sweeter. They don't have as much of a hop presence. And generally speaking, the alcohol content's a little on the higher end, say somewhere in the mid 6% range. We do a few beers of those styles, but in the tap room only. It turns out really tough sell in the market where all anyone wants is light, crisp, and hazy.
Gotcha. Okay.
Emily asked, what makes a beer a New England IPA? So really kind of quick story on how New England IPA came to be a thing, because it is a relatively new phenomenon. Let's face it, beer's been around for actual millennia. New England IPA has been around for about 5 years. So it is still very much the new kid on the block. And New England IPA was born as kind of a little bit of a branch off from Vermont IPA. There's a very well-known brewery up in Stowe, Vermont called The Alchemist that makes a world-famous beer called Heady Topper. And Heady Topper is an unfiltered double IPA. And the fact that it's unfiltered leaves a lot of that hop aroma intact, but it also leaves a visual haze intact. And New England IPA is sort of a byproduct of that, where people got carried away with more aroma and more haze, and the two are interrelated, and eventually developed this style, in a sense unintentionally, that has very little bitterness, tons of aroma, tons of flavor. Generally speaking, the carbonation level is a little bit lower, which helps to make the beer feel fuller and enhance the perception of juiciness on the palate. And the real kicker with New England IPAs is that the alcohol content tends to be a bit higher. Your traditional IPA is somewhere between 6 and 7.5%. New England IPA is more like 7 to 8.5%. And a big part of that is, as I mentioned earlier, alcohol is a solvent. More alcohol, more hops equals more flavor from the hops. That kind of is what defines New England IPA, but it is absolutely an evolving style, again, because it's so new. Stevie's a fan of Bohemian Shine. Yeah, Bohemian Shine, I'm not supposed to say this, but I'll tell all of you because you're all camels. Bohemian Shine is my favorite beer we make. If I walk into the tap room and it's on tap, they don't even ask what I want. They just put one in front of me because they know that's what I'm ordering.
Any more questions? I'm going to open it up and kind of let anyone chime in here. I think for the last few minutes, does that work, Adam?
Yeah, that's great.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Have you ever tried to make a non-alcoholic beer, and what do you think of that?
Yeah, great question. We have not, and in short, it's because we don't have the equipment. There are a few different ways to de-alkalize beer. All of them require special pieces of equipment that cost north of $250,000. So it's not an arena we've really dipped our toe into quite yet. I do think the category of non-alcoholic beer shows a lot of promise. We've already seen those trends, especially in the last year where people were home with nothing else to do. It's one thing to be home and have a bunch of alcoholic beers, but it's a little more productive to have a bunch of non-alcoholic beers. I will tell you though, personally, it's not something that I'm personally passionate about. For me, it's not even about the buzz, if you will. It's more that you just, at least with the technology that's out there today, can't get the same kinds of flavors and aromas and experiences from non-alcoholic beer because of what it requires to make it non-alcoholic.
Sort of like decaf.
Sort of like decaf. Yeah, I have yet to have a good cup of decaf coffee. Exact same thing. Mike and Scott asked where we want to see the business in 5 years. Awesome question. And I'll give you an answer. And if you had asked me the same question a year from now, it would change. But quite honestly, I'd like to expand our distribution regionally. So cover all of New England, plus maybe New York or Philly. I'd like to see a couple more tap rooms, quite honestly, beyond the South Boston tap room. I think it's a great experiential way for our consumers to, come see what we're all about in a way where we control the messaging. We have 2,500 retail partners that carry our beer throughout Southern New England, and they are awesome. But what they are not is us. And it's a totally different experience when someone can come into our home and talk to us and ask questions in real time and let us kind of, tell the story the way we want the story told. So I'd like to see some more tap rooms. And the other thing is, like, I believe in our people so much. Yes, I started the company. Yes, I'm the majority shareholder, but I would love to transition a portion of this company to our employees. They're the people that day after day keep this place running, absolutely make the most incredible beer and really make it all happen. And I would love to see this company become an employee-owned company. I don't know if that's a 5-year goal, a 10-year goal, or what, but I figured I'd mention it. Annalise wants to see a tap room in New London. Never say never. So my in-laws actually live in New London, right down by the Lighthouse Inn, and they would love it if I would put a tap room in New London because it means me and my wife would be around quite a bit more. I think New London would be a great spot for a tap room, honestly. There's some awesome property, especially down by the waterfront. So if anyone knows any real estate agents down that area, maybe send them my way.
All right. Last chance. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. A huge thank you to Adam for tonight. It was really such a perfect example of the sort of intersection between education, entertainment, and fun. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening, and happy reunion to those celebrating their reunion this week as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. And Dina, thank you to you and the con staff for helping make this happen. This is great.
Thank you so much.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Take
right.
care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.